So thank you all for joining this afternoon. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about the Small Charity Week campaign, which was a campaign that we're running in partnership between Global's Make Some Noise, NCVO, and Big Give. As panel members, and I'll give a bit more context to this in a moment, we just wanted to come together and provide some advice off the back of the applications that we saw and provide some transparency around the process. So here we have basically 4 of our panel members. So there are a couple of other people involved, but this is a pretty good chunk of the panel who actually sat around a table and made some decisions. So myself, Louise Jones, I'm a senior grants manager with Global's Make Some Noise. We have Josie Hinton, who was one of our NCVO representatives. We have Olivia Barker-White from Kids Club Kampala, who was brought into the panel to be a charity representative so that there was more charity voice represented in the decision-making process. So thank you, Olivia, for joining for the panel and for this session. And we have Sahil from Big Give. So before we kick off in earnest, we'll do some housekeeping. We just to keep everything in order and we can keep track of your questions, we'll use the chat box basically for introductions. So if you want to introduce yourself by putting your name and organization in there, you can do. And you can also use the chat to sort of spark any discussion, or if you have any tech issues, please put them in the chat. And for any questions that you want us to be able to, and also just to say that make sure to set your chat box to reply to everyone so everyone can see your responses rather than just one random person on the on the webinar. And then if you want us to respond to any questions specifically, then please do put it in the Q&A, which you should see down the bottom of your screen. There's a separate section for Q&A. So please do put your questions in there and we will try and get to as many as we can towards the end of this presentation. In terms of accessibility, if you want to add captions, you can do that again by going to sort of the toolbar at the bottom of this webinar. Or if that's not showing up for you, then you can go to More, which is the circle with the 3 dots in it, and click on that, and then the captions option should pop up, and you can add a sort of live transcript of the webinar. Finally, just to say that the webinar is being recorded, and we will make it available afterwards on Big Giv's YouTube channel, so you can watch it back or share it with your colleagues if you would like. Fabulous. Okay. And thank you to everyone who started introducing yourselves. So moving on then. Great. So there was a huge amount of enthusiasm and interest in this campaign. So thank you all for putting your applications forward. Whilst we appreciate that you didn't necessarily get the outcome that you were hoping for, we have absolutely no doubt that you're all doing incredible work. But just to provide some reassurance, the standard and the number of applications we received was just incredibly high. We also recognise the amount of time and effort and planning that goes into putting applications together. And the fact that I'm sure you're juggling multiple applications at once as well. So whilst we would have loved to have given individual feedback, with the number of applications we received, unfortunately, it just wasn't feasible. There just isn't enough of us to be able to provide that sort of like in-depth individual feedback. However, as a panel, we collectively felt it would be valuable to put on this session, which allows us to be sort of more transparent around our processes, to share any common themes that came up during that assessment of applications, to shed, and hopefully this will shed some light on what influenced our decision-making for this particular opportunity. But more than that, we also hope that understanding the common themes and top tips that we've compiled will hopefully also be useful going forward as you apply for other grants and other opportunities. Lots of what we'll be saying throughout this session will be sort of more widely applicable, and you'll be able to sort of take away some of these learnings and hopefully strengthen future applications as well. And finally, please do remember that Small Charity Week is much bigger than just this campaign that we ran. And there is, and it exists basically to highlight all of the amazing work that you're doing. So towards the end of the presentation, Josie's going to come on and share some resources and ideas for how you might still get involved with Small Charity Week outside of this campaign. And then we'll finish with plenty of time for questions because we really wanted to create like an open space for you guys to ask any questions that you might have about the decisions we made, and anything that can hopefully help you going forward. So how did we make decisions? If we go to the next slide, we had a much higher than expected number of applications. We had 842 in total. And we only had funds enough to make offers to around 194 of those, which ended up being around a 23% success rate. So as I'm sure you'll appreciate, we had a really tough job in our hands, and just reading through the applications, there were so many which were outstanding, and all of you put forward like really compelling cases, and we loved reading all of your applications, but we just didn't have the funds basically to fund everyone. And so this was a really difficult job that we had. And so in order to be able to make these decisions, we went through a specific sort of phased process. So if we go on to the next slide. This began with eligibility checks just to make sure that the projects fit the criteria in order to be able to apply. So these were published on Big Give's website. So things like whether the income for your charity fit within the specified range to qualify. And we also said that, for example, that people who are currently being actively funded by Global's Make Some Noise wouldn't be eligible. So we did those checks initially. We also did some rigorous, I say we, Sahil and his wonderful team at Big Give went through and did some rigorous due diligence assessments, which considered things like financial sustainability, reputation, and extreme views, and I guess viability of fundraising plans. This is looking in a bit more depth at kind of like websites, and just whether there was anything, any kind of red flags in terms of messaging. And we'll get on to that a bit later in terms of kind of wider things you might consider when you're making applications. After we did these checks, we then went on to a phase of scoring. So we were very lucky to have a large number of people involved in the scoring, both panel members, so the four of us, plus our other panel members, as well as some independent charity expert assessors, which were very kindly sourced by NCVO. The reason we had both panel members and we had independent assessors is that we wanted to make sure that every single application that made it through eligibility and due diligence was reviewed by at least two people. So that, at the very least, there were sort of two sets of opinions about applications, and they'd been given like the time and consideration that they all deserve. The other reason for this was that we wanted to make sure that there was a really good charity expert representation in the decision-making process, which I mentioned at the beginning, because for lots of us who sit in kind of funder positions, we don't necessarily have the kind of on-the-ground knowledge and understanding about how small charities work. So we wanted to make sure that there were tons of people involved in this who really understand the nitty-gritty and could feed into the way that we made our decisions. For everyone who was involved in scoring applications, we provided some detailed guidance and assessment criteria so they knew what to look for. We also put on a session kind of highlighting issues around kind of unconscious bias, and just making sure that the process was fair. So once all that scoring was done, oh sorry, Olivia, back when. Thank you. So once all that scoring was done, the panel, the four of us, as I said, and a few other people, got together in a room and we discussed the applications basically and decided ultimately which ones were going forward. And if we go on to the next slide. Fabulous. And in order to do this, we considered a few things. So obviously we had, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of applications, and we're only able to take forward around 194 in the end. So there were a few sort of factors that we looked at. So the two kind of big ones, which kind of fed into the scoring that I just mentioned as well, were the case for need and your potential for impact. So for scoring, we considered these separately. So each of our scorers provided a score for kind of how well the case for need was presented and how well the sort of potential for impact was presented. So what do we mean by each of these? In terms of need, we were looking at the relevancy and urgency of the problem being addressed, evidence that the issues affect a significant or underserved or an underserved population. So we weren't necessarily just looking at whether the project affects a huge number of people, but also whether there was specific groups who perhaps just don't have access to services or support. We also considered how well we thought the charity understood that it's the community it was trying to help, and any kind of challenges or barriers they might be facing. Again, we'll kind of be coming onto this later when we're talking about common themes and top tips. When we consider potential for impact, we were trying to make a judgment about how likely we thought it was that the charity's work will result in positive change. So a lot of this will be around kind of clarity and quality of the plans and the approach put forward, the kind of detail provided there, which helped convince us that, that you would be able to achieve what you were setting out to. And another thing that we looked at as well was the capacity of charities to deliver and sustain the outcomes that they were, again, aiming for. So in addition to that, that gave us a kind of good sort of guide in terms of the sort of applications which were kind of strongest in terms of there being a real need for the project or the funding that you were requesting, and the likelihood that it would deliver on the impact that it set out to. But we also needed to consider more broadly the kind of spread in terms of the funding that we were allocating. So a few other things that we considered were the size of charities. So we recognize that smaller charities have fewer resources and perhaps less experience in applying for funding. And so one of the other things we thought about was whether we needed to spend a bit more time, I guess, considering those ones who maybe have less time and fewer people, basically, to put applications forward. Another thing we looked at was regional spread. So we don't want to unintentionally end up funding lots of applications in London, for example. And so we considered the distribution of the offers that we made for Small Charities Week. And finally, we also did a little bit of analysis in terms of EDI, so equity, diversity, and inclusion, and looked at kind of like whether there was leadership from minoritized groups for each of the charities. I would say that these last three things that I've mentioned that we considered certainly played into our decision making, but for the most part, it was around this sort of like case for need and potential for impact. So now that we've covered the kind of overarching process of how we made the decisions, let's get into some common themes which cropped up as we scored the applications in detail. So up first, evidence is always a big one. So it is really important that you clearly describe the need for the service and the support you offer, and including evidence can really help to both elevate and strengthen your case. Incorporating data can bring the scale and the urgency of the problem you're trying to address to life. So for example, if you refer to the number of people affected by the problem or include quotes on trends or predictions which show that the needs of your services are increasing, which means that demand is high, that helps make the case that essentially the funding is urgent. So for example, if you are providing a food bank service and you're talking about the fact that cost of living means that the reliance on food banks is going through the roof, and there's lots of publicly available statistics on that. So including that sort of data, which gives us a sense of the scale, the urgency, and the demand for your service, can really make a difference. We also understand, though, that not everyone is working on a problem which affects huge numbers of people. So you might be looking at this or hearing what I'm saying and worrying that perhaps you can't find those publicly available stats because you work in a more niche area or you work with smaller groups of beneficiaries. And just to say that we absolutely do take that into account and we appreciate the value of the work that all of you do. So in that case, you might instead think about describing the impact of a lack of support on specific outcomes for those people. So even though you're only working with a handful of people, for example, you might say that without this service, for example, mental well-being is 30% lower than the general population. Those are the kinds of things you might be able to find again in these sort of publicly available statistics. And there's also some other things that you can think about as well in terms of gathering evidence. It doesn't just have to be these big headline stats. So while I say that there is a kind of hierarchy of evidence, I think anything you can provide helps strengthen your case. So if you can quote well-validated research or surveys which include lots and lots of people, then brilliant, that's fantastic. You can usually find these on government websites or by doing a Google, like looking at kind of big advocacy pages, for example, or using Google Scholar. Obviously, do your kind of research into these just to make sure that they are legit stats, but there's lots of that out there. So please do have a little look. But there is also a huge amount of insight that can be extracted from data that you already collect that perhaps you could analyze in a different way to support your applications as well. So even just mentioning things like the number of people that you support, or again, if you don't work with that many people, you could be talking about the fact that 90% of people say that they were satisfied with your service. Those kind of things help give us an indication that you're showing impact, and Josie's going to talk about this in a bit more detail, but also that there's demand for your services. And you might be surprised when you think about kind of what you're already asking from people in feedback forms, etc., about what you might be able to pull together that can also help with your applications. And finally, I just wanted to mention case studies and quotes. So these can be an incredible storytelling tool, but just think about, be mindful of the fact that they can also be quite wordy. So often with applications, including this one, there is a limited amount of kind of characters or words you can put forward. So do be mindful of the amount of space you take up with this. And I would say case studies are something that can be incredibly powerful for raising donations and fundraising with the general public. With funding applications, if you have room to put them in, pop them in. But do prioritize these kind of like broader statistics and figures if you can, because it gives a kind of more well-rounded view of what you're up to. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to hand over to Josie, who's going to tell you a little bit more about what we saw on impact.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks for having me on this. It's really, really good to be here. So just talking a little bit more about impact, I thought it would be helpful to put down just some of the things that really were kind of where people scored really strongly what they did in terms of impact. So when we were reading through the applications, organizations that scored the highest, first of all, they really were able to communicate their impact clearly and concisely. So either the impact that they were making or the impact that they hoped to make. So strong applications, as Louise has already hinted at, shared qualitative and quantitative evidence of their impact, for example, through feedback from their beneficiaries, through the numbers of people that they had supported in the past or that they were hoping to support, with obviously sort of some clear evidence of how they were going to be able to do that. And also like things like the percentage difference that their work was making on sort of identified metrics. So that was the first thing that really stood out. The second thing was that their impact really linked to the objectives and goals of the organization or project that they were seeking funding for, as well as an identified need. So what we really saw was that in those applications, there was a really like coherent narrative that ran through the application from need to impact. Thirdly, they really articulated a strategy for achieving impact. So there was they were really clear about the change they wanted to make and also about how they were going to do it. And we could see through the rest of the application that there was some kind of thinking around sustainability on that point. Finally, lots of people talked about the way that they either had measured impact in the past or how they were planning on measuring impact if it was like a new project. And what they identified in the strong applications was impact measurement that was appropriate to the size and scale of the operation. So we felt like there was a sustainable method for measuring impact. So just to give an example, like we were not expecting organizations that were really small with like only 2 members of staff to have conducted like a full social return on investment or done any detailed analysis. So yeah, saw some really interesting ways of measuring impact that was sustainable. And then finally, the impact was really rooted in how it served the organization or project's beneficiaries, which I think probably seems fairly obvious, but worth kind of highlighting. I'm going to hand over now to Sahil to talk about track record.
Thanks, Josie. Yeah, so track record, we really wanted to charities to describe your successes both in terms of your work, but also in terms of your fundraising experience. So in terms of your work, this goes back to what Josie and Louise have both said about showcasing how many people you've helped, like with that data, if you have that available, and that sort of impact on their lives. So as Louise mentioned, if you have the space to include that snippets from those people in terms of quotes, if there is space to include that. But really that helps bring your work more to life and understands your experience as an organization in helping the people that you serve, but also how they're being served as well. And then in terms of including information about previous successful fundraising campaigns, we do ask that in the application. So we did see a lot of charities not include this, so that could be because they don't have any fundraising experience, which is fine, and that wasn't the ultimate decider of whether a charity got funding or not. But if you're applying for funding for a fundraising campaign, we would definitely suggest prioritizing that, just because it gives us an indication of how likely you are to achieve your campaign target. So as well as looking at the work that you're doing, we'll also want to assess, like, what is your plan to raise donations, and do you have that track record in achieving that? But when you're filling out funding applications, always, like, don't be afraid to shout about your successes, because that really gives funders the sort of confidence that you can deliver on the work that you're doing and it can have a major impact. If we could go to the next slide. And then ask for what you need. So don't ask for too much, but also don't ask for too little. So yeah, the funding request should be proportional to the project that you're seeking to raise funds for. So if you're seeking to raise funds, for example, or applying for £1,000 for a project that's ultimately going to cost like hundreds of £1,000s, then that sort of does give some alarm bells about where the rest of the funding is coming from and how impactful this actual funding will be to that larger project. Likewise, if you're seeking only £10,000 to help a very small amount of people or a very small project, then again, that's going to raise red flags. So just ask for what you need, rather than trying to figure out what the funders are looking for in the application, in terms of trying to game the application that way. Also ask for funding which is in relation to your organization size. If you're a very small organization, for example, asking for a lot of funding, again, in relation to your income size, that's going to raise a lot of red flags for us. If you're asking, for example, for funding which is 50% of your last income, we're going to wonder if that is actually sustainable for the organization and for the work that you're doing in the long term, because once that funding dries up, where is it going to continue to come from? And then, as mentioned at the last point, is if you are seeking to be funding for a bigger part of the project, just make sure you clearly state how the rest of the funds will be coming from, because we want to understand how that project will be delivered. We did see a couple of applications that missed this, for example, and then that was sort of for us an indication about, well, we don't know how the project will ultimately be finished, because there isn't a clear financing plan detailed in this application. I'll now pass over, I think, to Olivia next.
Hi, thanks for that. Yes, so I'm now just going to talk through a few additional top tips. I think just to say that these top tips are very much just additional top tips. The kind of main decision making, as we've already mentioned, was definitely around making sure the need's been evidenced, that you talked about impact and a clear plan for that, and track record. So these are just sort of additional things. You could get all these top tips right, but if the need isn't evidenced correctly, then that was probably why an application was unsuccessful. But there were quite a lot of organisations that were very, very good applications, and it was hard to make a decision. And so some of these top tips I'm going to share are sort of the things that just maybe clinched it for one organisation over another. The first one is around co-design. We did see some excellent applications that did this really, really well, and just explaining how beneficiaries and those with lived experience have been involved in the design and ongoing development of the services and the support that you offer. This shows that you understand the nuances of the individuals and communities that you're helping and the barriers they face and what help is really needed. So making sure that if you are doing this, that you mention it in the application. If you are doing this, you provide some evidence for this, whether talking about needs assessments that have happened, or just explaining how some of the projects have been co-designed, or even when funding applications have had beneficiary voices within that, or quotes from service users and things like that really did make applications stand out. And also think beyond the application as well. The application is obviously the important part, but it's not standalone. We are looking at the organisations as a whole, and we did look at things such as websites, social media, charity commission profile, etc. And if there were some that we saw, there were some applications that were really, really excellent application, but when you looked at the charity's website, it didn't sit the overall organisation didn't seem to be particularly aligned with the project that the application was for. So whether that's because the website hadn't been updated or if it was something new, but just making sure that things are in line with that. Really importantly as well, just making sure that accounts are up to date with the Charity Commission. If we look on the Charity Commission profile and you've got the big red across it because the accounts are overdue, that is a bit of a red flag. So just making sure that all the accounting, governance, etc., that there's no issues with anything like that. And also charity social media, again making sure the social media and sort of programs are relevant to the application, but also things like use of appropriate language, use of how beneficiaries are presented in social media. Is it done appropriately? Are you treating beneficiaries with dignity? Are there any red flags around language or patronization? So just be mindful of that. And also I think seeing this as an opportunity to learn, and seeing that if the application was unsuccessful, is taking these tips and how can you use these for further applications, but also for donations from other areas. Also, I was speaking to an assessor from a different funding program, but they said that they had an example where a charity had been unsuccessful for an application for funding and taken that very badly, and sent a very rude and strongly worded email to the trust telling them what they thought of being unsuccessful. Well, unfortunately, that places a big red flag on that trust's radar, and funders do talk to each other. So it's just being mindful that whether that's on your social media or if you're actually in person interacting with a funder, just being mindful of being appropriate and not taking things too emotionally if unsuccessful. However, not all assessors are this thorough. I just think it's useful to share some of these top tips. Don't avoid leaving. You can leaving crucial information out of your application. You can't guarantee that they'll find it. So not everyone does look at websites and etc. So, but it's just useful to make sure that any key things that might be missed are also included in the application. And finally, consider who will be assessing. So some funders provide details on who will be assessing the application, and you can check this out and tailor the application for the audience. Some funders, if you look at their websites or their Charities Commission profiles, will sort of clearly say what their priorities are, so you can tailor applications to speak more to what they use and using some of their terminology. But if it isn't clear, then write with the aim to please a variety of assessors, including those unfamiliar with your work and your sector, as well as those who know it inside out. So don't assume that an assessor will have heard of you or know what you do, but equally don't spend the whole application explaining who you are and miss out talking more about the project and impact. So it's just getting that balance. just going to hand over to Josie now to talk about what's next for Small Charity Week.
Thanks, Olivia. So just moving on, I just wanted to quickly touch on NCVO and NCVO's membership, partly because we do have a special offer for our membership for those that weren't successful with the Big Give match funding. So just in case you didn't know, so NCVO is a membership organisation. We currently have about 17,000 members, ranging from those kind of big household names to kind of much smaller community groups. If you're not a member, we would love you to join us. The aim of our membership really is to provide you with a community, but also to save you time and money. So we have lots of information and guidance and tools and templates that you can download to help you with running your organisation. And we also do a lot of research in terms of what's happening in the sector that we know organisations find useful, actually, particularly for funding applications. Lots of people contacting us saying, oh, you know, where can we find data on X, Y, and Z? Because we're doing a funding application. So we do, yeah, that data and that research is really helpful.
Sorry to jump in, Olivia, would you mind moving just to the next slide? Because I think Josie's about to
Oh, sorry.
give there we
There we go. Yeah,
no
thank
worries.
you. So members are the kind of only group really that get access to all of the stuff that we offer. And if you're a small charity with an income under 30,000, then our membership is free. Just specifically for this audience, really, we are actually inviting unsuccessful applicants of the Big Give match funding to join NCVO and get their first year of membership for free. And also offering a 50% discount on your second year of membership. So hopefully that's of interest to some of you, if not all of you. The offer is available up until the end of July this year, and obviously you can cancel your membership at any time. These slides, I think, are going to be circulated afterwards, but you can apply for this offer by submitting an application form to membership and then putting in the discount code, which is SCWGIVE. So moving on to the next slide. So obviously the Big Give match funding campaign is very much integrated with what's happening during Small Charity Week. Thank you, Tracy, I see you've already joined up, so thank you for that. Obviously, yes, so our this campaign is sorry, the Big Give match funding is very much linked to Small Charity Week. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we're doing during the week and what you can expect, and also how you can get involved. So as probably most of you know, the week runs from the 23rd to the 28th of June. Very aptly, this year's theme is financial sustainability and resilience. We know that resilient charities obviously build stronger communities, but small charities in particular are facing rising costs, growing demands, and falling funding, which means that they're under more pressure than ever. So we really, really wanted to highlight that this year. In terms of how you can get involved in the week, there are quite a few ways. So one is we'd really ask you to spread the word. If you go onto the resources page of the Small Charity Week website, which is www.smallcharityweek.org.uk, you can find lots of tips, templates, etc., to help you kind of raise awareness of the week. You can also join an event and also advertise your own event that you're doing as part of the week. So organisations can now submit events that they're hosting for the week, and there's just a short form that needs to be submitted in order to do that, and your event will be live on the Small Charity Week website. We've put in the resources section lots of support and learning opportunities and resources and help and guidance that's kind of free to access during the week. And then finally, this week is part of a campaign really around financial sustainability and resilience. And so we really want to kind of raise awareness at both a local political level, but also at the national kind of political level. So there will be a letter on our website that you can adapt and send to your MP, which will really highlight issues around financial sustainability and resilience facing small charities. So please do, if you're in touch with your local MP, please do look at that letter and do send it, and share some of the very stark data that will be coming out around what's facing the sector over the coming year in terms of financial sustainability and resilience. I hope that's helpful. Please do get involved. And I'm going to hand back over now to, I think it's Sahil.
Thanks, Josie. Yeah, so this is now the part where you can ask us your questions. Please use that Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom panel to ask your questions to us. So we do have a couple to get started. They're actually from Giovanni Lapina from Way Forward. So she has two questions here. The first question is, were there organizations that submitted for core funding that were selected for funding? Yeah, Louise, do you want to answer that or just?
Yeah, no, I just looked up the numbers
Yeah.
when I saw this one came in, because I know that we did, but I was interested in the proportion. So 131 of the 194 applications that were made an offer were for unrestricted applications. So yeah, certainly it was a real mix of project-based applications and those looking for more core funding.
If I think I did the rough analysis of all applications we received, and it was about a 60-40 split. I think 60% applied for core funding and 40 applied for restricted funding, which was an interesting mix overall. And then, did you have a minimum target of organizations you were aiming to fund, or was it based on the level of funding that was available? Yeah, Louise.
Yeah, unfortunately, funds. We would love to have a even higher number of charities we were supporting, but just the money isn't there, is it? So yeah, unfortunately, it was based on the budget that we had.
This question, I think it's for me. If we're successful in securing a pledge, are we eligible to be considered suitable for a Christmas challenge application, or would you feel that if we have not yet delivered a successful campaign in the small charity week, we will not have enough strong record to be considered? You can definitely apply for the Christmas challenge campaign. Just because you were unsuccessful for the small charity week application, it does not mean you will necessarily be unsuccessful for Christmas challenge. We take each individual application on its own merit. So definitely, you can definitely apply and you will be considered for funding for the Christmas challenge. So interesting question. There was a lot of focus on impact and beneficiaries. Are there any tips for charities that focus on research and campaigning? I don't know who wants to jump in here.
Happy to say one or two thoughts, Sahil, if that's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, good question. I think there are a couple of I think the tips that I gave are equally applicable. So I think if you're focusing on research and campaigning, you can still really articulate the change that you want to see through the research and campaigning that you're planning on doing. And I think you can still be quite clear about what will change as a result of hopefully you'll have a clear understanding of what will change as a result of any research or campaigning that you're planning on doing. I think things around, evidencing need are still exactly the same. Going back to kind of Sahil's point on sort of track record as well, what your track record is in that space is equally important. I don't know if anyone else has any other thoughts.
That was great, Josie. That was really helpful.
Josie, there's probably a follow-up question here for you.
Oh, yeah.
Is NCVO membership open to Scottish charities?
Yes, I'm very sad, but the answer is no. I did sort of think as I read this question, is there some link that we should have made with SCVO to see if unsuccessful applicants of the Big Give campaign could get membership to SCVO? But unfortunately, we haven't done that. So the answer is no. Yeah, I don't really know what else to say on that.
If you're new to digital fundraising but need to evidence fundraising success in the application, how is best to proceed? I wouldn't say you have to evidence fundraising success, but I would say if you're applying for a digital fundraising sort of application, definitely highlight that as probably one of your first successes. But obviously, as a charity, if you don't have that digital fundraising success, talk about the other successes you have, like what grants you've been awarded, what major donations you've secured, what maybe other events that you've run. So again, that question about your sort of experience in fundraising or other activities wasn't a sort of a determinant if you got funding or not, but it just helps us understand like your capabilities as an organization. So just talk about the other successes you've had if you are new to digital fundraising. There's a good question here from Oscar. Oscar's from Cloudwater Zen, a mental health charity in Glasgow. Is there any way of seeing great successful applications with clear needs and impacts? We're not super experienced with applications and could be interested to see what those solid applications look like. If you cannot share examples, could you talk about examples of what great need or impact looks like? I think I can start here. Just we will be publishing all the campaign pages of the successful charities on our website. So while we can't share the full details of what was in the application, you can definitely visit those campaign pages to see what they wrote in the questions that we can publish publicly. And so that can give you a good idea of how they articulated some of that data into their application. So that's definitely a start of where you can sort of find that information about what successful charities included in their application. But I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in here.
I guess I would just say a lot of what we kind of covered earlier on in the presentation. So when we're thinking about getting across the sort of case for need, it's really because all of you would have put forward an explanation of sort of like why you think your charity is needed. I guess it's about the clarity of the case, and also I guess explaining that for people who are less familiar with your particular charity's focus, whilst also including like good evidence. So for example, a really strong case for need might clearly explain, I guess, what problem you were trying to solve. It would explain, I guess, like who is affected by that problem and the size of the issue. So to try and give an example, so if we were going to say that, you know, there are X number of LGBTQ people in the UK, and based on X research, they generally have 20% lower mental well-being, which can lead to issues in employment, education, etc., etc. That kind of really kind of thorough case, which is well evidenced, really stood out. So we know that why you're there. And then I guess in terms of the potential for impact, explaining kind of what you're doing, which you think is going to help there. So in that particular example I gave, it might be providing specific services or support for LGBT people. Ideally, it would be great if you could, as Olivia mentioned, include some lived experience to explain how you came up with your offer. So not just basically saying, I've seen a problem and I'm going to throw things at it, but rather this is really well considered. I've involved people who are affected by it and I know what support they need, rather than me just guessing what I think they need. That really helped. And then I guess also if we're talking about kind of publicly available statistics, you might think about like finding some research or research that says, for example, people who get support see a huge increase in their happiness. That kind of thing might be helpful. Or if we're looking at survey data, you know, people saying that, you know, this is what we want. or just like again thinking about your track record as well. So we've previously worked with a cohort of 200, and of those 10% have gone on to whatever. That anything like that really helps to give a sense of the scale of your project or the work that your charity is doing, and or the size of, I guess, the potential impact. And that doesn't necessarily need to be about the number of people you're helping. As I mentioned earlier, we appreciate that some of you work with very small numbers of people, and in that case it's talking about the size of the difference you're making to the people you're working with. I hope that helps a little bit.
Question here is this is a Northern Ireland specific question. Are there representatives from Northern Irish charities assessing the applications to consider the evidence of need? Also, if you have a social enterprise income but with the primary purpose of charitable trading, would the people assessing the application understand this so not as to consider that income against you? Then, Louise, do you just want to speak about how we gather the assessors or their mix of who who we approach to be an assessor, basically?
Yeah, of course. And then I might hand back to you if that's okay to answer a bit about the income, because you did a lot of the digging in around this for the due diligence processes. So I mean, in general, so I'm not sure that if we had anyone from Northern Ireland in the independent assessors group, which is certainly something that we can think about in the future. I think what I would say though is that our priority was really to make sure that we had people who understood the challenges that are being faced by small charities at the moment in the process. So both in that independent assessor group and the people who are sat on the panel, so Olivia being one of them, which we hope provided that sort of insight that we needed to feed into the decision-making process. I guess if in terms of evidencing the need, if there is a specific sort of local experience that you think would be beneficial, then I would say in terms of advice going forward, put that in your application. So if you can sort of quote research articles, your own data, which helps show what the specific local issue is, that is something that means that like any assessor looking at that, regardless of whether they're from Northern Ireland or not, will be able to appreciate the sort of nuanced problem that you're facing there. So I'd say just include that in your application, because you can never guarantee, I guess, who's on the other side of this looking at your application.
And thanks, Louise. And on the second question about the income, so basically, when we're looking at the income levels of charities, we're basically looking at what their income is registered with the Charity Commission, OSCR, or the Northern Irish Charity Commission. So that is what we take as your income. So that, and then if we have any further questions, we'll examine your accounts in more detail. And if we have any questions after that, we would contact you. But that is how we sort of assess the level of income a charity has. So whatever's registered with the Northern Irish Commission, when you land on your sort of page on their website, that is what we will be looking at when we're doing our eligibility checks. And then Michael has a question here about how many of the 842 applications failed step 1 eligibility and due diligence. Can you advise those that failed the step what they need to address next time? It was about 30 to 40 applications, I think, that failed that initial sort of eligibility checks. Where they did fail those checks, we would have actually contacted them. So it was things like it was a charity not working in the UK, for example. So for this round of funding, charities have to be working with UK communities, and or there were some charities, for example, that had an income that exceeded £1 million. So yeah, those charities would have been notified about why they failed the eligibility checks. When it comes to due diligence, I don't recall any specific charities failing due diligence for like accounts not being filed or anything like that. But if there were, we would have again notified charities or definitely got in touch with them just to ask for any clarification there. When we are doing those checks, we do more often than not, we do actually contact the charity first to find out if there's some sort of context to why, for example, a charity hasn't filed accounts, just to get the full picture before we fail them at that stage. Cool. Can't see any further questions. I don't know if there were any questions in the chat that I may have missed.
There is a question in the chat from
Yeah.
Rebecca. Rebecca is asking, does evidence need to be referenced?
I would say with this, it depends on the funder. I would say from probably most of you, especially if you're not applying for kind of research grants, probably not. Like it's good if you can. So like all I'm talking about here is like an in-text reference. So that would just be like the name of the organization that did the research and maybe a year. And certainly within the word counts that we've given you, we wouldn't be expecting like a reference list or anything like that. But yeah, if you can just just put an indicator of where you got that from. That also helps as well if it is a really reputable resource, like a government website, for example. You can just include that there as well, and it just helps add to that kind of robustness of it, I suppose.
Thanks, Louise. I think those are all the questions, but before everyone leaves, we do want to sort of try and do a poll just to sort of see your feedback from this session. So hopefully I can get this to launch. So if everyone, hopefully this is working for everyone. So if you could just take a couple of seconds just to answer so we can give a few more seconds to give people a chance to answer that. Still some answers coming in. That's great to see. Okay, I'll end it there. Thank you everyone for feeding that back to us. Really appreciate it. But yeah, I'll hand over to Louise now.
All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining this today. Hopefully it's been helpful. We'll find out very soon when we get the results. I think Sahil is the only one who can see them right now. But yeah, hopefully you've all taken away something from this, which is new, or, has provided you some insight into kind of what our processes are. And, you've gathered some tips that you can take forward into future applications and opportunities. Yeah, so we'll wrap it up here. As we said at the beginning, a recording will be made available on Big Give's YouTube channel. So if you do want to share it on, please do. I guess other than that, have a wonderful afternoon. And thank you again for joining.
Bye.